Today is the 10th, I believe. No, it's the 9th. It's the 9th of Kislev. Wednesday, the 25th of November. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving. It's Erev Thanksgiving. We get 2 days since we're outside the land of Israel. Or maybe it's the other way around. All right. Last week we finished the words of the philosopher, and the Kuzari, the king of the Khazars, was ultimately unsatisfied with what the philosopher had been presenting him, because he just saw that it was insufficient and it wasn't addressing his main concerns. His main concern is what my actions should be. And the philosopher ultimately said, your actions don't really matter. It's not so important. As long as you're moral, as long as you're a good person, good human being, which isn't super incorrect. It's just not satisfactory to our main protagonist. Okay. So today, let's see, this being the case, we'll continue, if my computer will cooperate with me, with the words of the Kuzari and his thoughts on what he had just encountered and the next person of wisdom that he will talk to. So let me just pull it up. Okay, let me share my screen. There's a little bit of a lag, it seems like, with my computer, so I apologize for any extra time it takes. Okay. Pause share, just give me 1 second here. Sorry.
All right. It's the right spot.
There we go. Okay. Excuse me. So we are, just to recap on the last little thing that the Khazar said last week, he said, let me ask Edom, the Christians and Ishmael, the Muslims, surely one of them has the right path of desirable actions. There is no point, however, in seeking out Judaism. The fact that Jews are so small in number and universally despised proves that they must be wrong. I want to point out that later on, we're on page 58, I think on page 68, or is it 66? He restates his reason why not to talk to the Jews, and here he includes that they have no connection to their past and no depth or wisdom. So not a very favorable view of us right now. Hold on a second. What's this? I don't want to do that anymore. Okay. So he continues then. And I want to point out that in the Hebrew, because here he calls him a Christian scholar. I like where the calls him the kids, but he calls them the wise of Edom, the wise people of Rome or of the West. So he asks him about his religion. But that's not exactly what he's asking about here. Here in the Hebrew, you can see asking about specifically his actions. I want to know about what he thinks about things, but I want to know what are his actions and are they appropriate in, are they going to solve my conundrum here? Amar lo, the Christian says. And just like with the Greek, where we saw that there are a lot of things that we agree with, I think we're going to see the same thing, even more so here, just because we're so familiar with each other's cultures. He says, I believe that the universe was created and that the blessed God preceded all. He created the world in 6 days. All human beings are descended from the first man, Adam, and they trace themselves back to him as well as to Noah after him. So far, almost identical to what you would expect to hear from a Jewish person or a Chacham. God supervises all of creation and is especially involved with mankind. This is a complete 180-degree thought process than the Greek. But the Greek thinks God is so far removed and has no supervision of mankind and no involvement with humanity. Here we see that the Christian believes that not only is he supervising creation and has what's called hashgacha, as we can see here, a direct involvement or direct supervision, he is involved with mankind specifically, meaning that we see that he believes that mankind is the pinnacle of this creation. God shows wrath to sinners and mercy to the righteous. God speaks and appears on different levels to prophets and other saintly people. I'm not sure, or saintly persons, excuse me. He dwells among a chosen nation of people. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with the idea of saints in Christianity. You've probably heard the term before. This person's a saint, or Saint George, or whatever, or Saint Nicholas. I think that's the season we're in now. But saints are a sort of intermediary position. They, well, at least in Catholicism, I'm not sure about all other Christian denominations, but in Catholicism, a person would pray to a saint to have that saint then present the person's case on their behalf to God. Almost like how people pray, like at the end of a Christian prayer, you'll say, "In Jesus' name we pray," and that's how your prayer gets sent up to God, because God will only hear it if it's coming through some sort of intermediary. But these saintly persons, these saints, I want to say he calls them Hasidav, his Hasidim, his pious people. They are the ones who are just connected a little bit beneath the prophets here. And that's not so different. I mean, it's vastly different than how we view it, but in terms of how we have a Navi and a Hasid, and then that's like the two different levels there, we kind of in Jewish mysticism also have the same hierarchy. And then the last thing he says, that he dwells among a chosen nation of people. Who are we talking about here when he says, the Christian says, he dwells among a chosen nation of people? Who do we think he's talking about?
Israel.
Israel, because that's how we see it in the Bible. In their Bible, which they're going to say that they believe in, they say that it says that the Jewish people are clearly God's chosen people. However, in Christianity, and it's not so widely spread belief, but in Christianity, there are two Israels. There's carnal Israel and Veris Israel. Carnal Israel are the people, like the Jewish people. We embody the form of Israel in this world. But Veris Israel, the true chosen people, are the ones who believe in Christianity. They are the true chosen people and represent God's will on earth. And this is what's called replacement theology, where you can't really uproot what it says in the Bible, because you are going to say that I believe in this, especially since he starts off his whole thing with saying Ani ma'amin, which if you've ever been to a Jewish camp or heard Jewish children, there's that song, Ani ma'amin be'emunah shelema. I believe with complete faith. And it goes through I don't think it goes through all 13 principles of Maimonides, but it's usually a be'viat Mashiach, on the coming of Messiah. But here, Ani Ma'amin is something that's very much captured in Christian vocabulary, the concept of having faith in something. And the difference between Jewish faith and Christian faith, I think we will elaborate on as we go deeper into the Christian man's words. So when he says,
Joseph?
Yes, go ahead, Tamir.
Yeah, the more from the standpoint, or you phrased it in terms of believers, but I think in Christian theology, they really see the church itself as the new Israel. and
Ah.
especially in Catholicism,
Okay.
which is the oldest classical form of Christianity, is that they see the church as replacing the Jewish people.
Good point. That's actually that's actually probably true. Thank you
And
for bringing that
and,
up.
and from their standpoint, the Jewish people were the original chosen people, but they rejected Christ, so therefore the church is their replacement.
Yes. Yes. And the church is, I think, in especially like in the Gospels, the church is considered the bride of Christ. Here is an image. I'm trying to figure out, and let me find the original statue. The original statue is something to look at, is very interesting. I might only be able to.
Amir,
Yeah,
when you say the church, what do you mean?
I mean the institution of the church replaced Israel, and that it's not just a question of the believers, Christians, or replace Israel. It's that the church itself became the replacement for Israel. This is from what I've understood of classical Christianity, and also that what Joseph just referred to is the church became the bride of Christ, and this is the same metaphor that the Jewish people used. The Jews were, and Jewish literature talks about the Jewish people being the bride to God.
But when you say the church, it's different than when we say Israel, all the people, all the Jewish people. You're talking
Right.
about the specific institution, not the people that believe in that institution.
Right. The institution itself became important because the institution was the intermediary for the believers. But people couldn't get to God except through the church, through the mechanisms of the church. They gave a lot of importance to the worship, and the priests were the intermediaries. I mean, they changed the nature. In Judaism, you don't need an intermediary to reach God. You don't need to talk through a rabbi or talk through a Kohen.
Judaism has no analog to what you're calling the church.
Yes, correct.
I follow you.
And we have institutions and law and the Sanhedrin and all that stuff, and the temple worship, but it was down to the individual Jew who did things to reach God. And Judaism was a personal religion that people individually could reach God. In Christianity, that was changed.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, why does Christ exist at all? Is Christ as the Son of God, or as one of the Trinity of the forms of God? Christ was the way to reach. You can only reach God through Jesus Christ, and that Jesus spoke through his disciples, and the priests there was always this intermediary step of saints and priests that the individual Christian didn't reach God, not in classical Christianity through himself, but through the institutions of the church and through the Gospels or the saints. Later on, Protestantism rejected that, and individual people could accept Jesus as a personal savior directly, but Jesus was always the intermediary. But the church itself, in classical Christianity, and Catholicism was the original, right? And that they set up the institutions to replace what came before, both in terms of Judaism and in paganism. The temples and the worship of deities and idols, they replaced all that with Christian theology. But the concept of intermediary and reaching God through others, or through the institution, that was normative, and that the church was the new Israel.
It was an effective way of regulating the beliefs and practices of what was happening, of the new church, of the new Christian religion.
Right. And I would say that Judaism was sort of a simpler setup. It was a more direct setup for people. That the spirituality was an individual thing. In Christianity, spirituality became a group thing. It became an institutional thing.
And this was also after the destruction of the temple, so you didn't have to do that. Yeah.
Right.
That's really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I like what Yosef said, especially about the idea of labeling Christianity replacement theology. They had to take over the Jewish concept of being wed to God and being chosen. And they had to become the new chosen people.
You see, and especially in the Zohar, well, the Zohar is also in the context of Christian Spain. You see in the Zohar itself, you have this sort of semantical assimilation presenting itself in the text of the Zohar when you have the statement of Oraita kuchabrichu ve'Israel hadhu, that the Torah, God, and Israel are one. And it's sort of like saying, like, some people will say that it's sort of like trying to use the cognate of the Trinity to explain what our main cores are as well. And the idea of, in this, not Israel, excuse me, Knesset Israel, the gathering of Israel. And like this Knesset Israel being a cognate of sorts to the concept of church or ecclesia. And it's interesting because we have the book of Koheleth. Koheleth is translated as, in English, or not in English, but in the Christian Bible, it's translated to the Latin as Ecclesiastes. And the reason it's called Ecclesiastes is because that's kind of the translation of Koheleth. Koheleth is kahal, to a gathering of wisdom, of sayings. Ecclesiastes is that eclectic also sort of idea. So the church in Latin is called ecclesia. And this image right here is two statues that are at Notre Dame, the cathedral, not the college, called Ecclesia y Synagoga. Now, the ecclesia here is the church, who is dignified, wearing a crown, has a staff and the goblet over here. And the synagoga is this shamed woman with her hair unbared. She's blind because she can't see the truth of the Gospels here. And this is the idea that because the Jewish people have lost their way, they're totally blind to what the reality is, the ecclesia, the church, has come to reaffirm God's berit with the world through the covenant of blood and sacrifice and resurrection that is represented by Jesus. So that is the new people that he's dwelling among, or the new institution he's dwelling among. You could say that is the church itself.
Right. And can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. And also the thing that's very interesting is that the Christians adopted the Jewish view that God was, they moved away from the classics, and God was a personal and creator who was involved in creation, mm-hmm. which was originally a Jewish concept, and that God is personal, God acts in human history, and the Christians definitely took that over and rejected classical ancient thought.
Yes, absolutely. You have this melding of different worldviews going on in Christianity.
Right. And later the Muslims did the same thing. They took that over as well.
Yes.
Their view, the big break here, both from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, was to say that God is not, the creator is not just some blind force and people just kind of dilly-dally their way through, and individuals could be philosophers, but there is no personal relationship with the divine.
Yes.
That's the big break here with modern religion.
Yes, absolutely. So let's continue in the text here, unless we have any questions. I see Eleanor. Eleanor, go ahead.
I have some problems with the part that says God shows wrath to sinners and mercy to the righteous. Mm-hmm. Because the concept of bad things happen to good people, mm-hmm. and how you get the idea that, well, the one idea is that it isn't God punishing necessarily the good or the bad, or like your own actions, your own free will, your own things that you do in your life that affect things. But God being involved with us is one thing, but controlling the anger toward people or the harmful things, which is the opposite here, the harmful things to people who have done good all their life, to the righteous. And I don't know if this is considered basic Judaism. Maybe it is, but I have trouble with it. I know right here it's talking about Christianity, but
Right.
But I personally have trouble with it.
And that's totally 100% okay. And it's not, a person isn't supposed to be settled with like, oh, okay, this is a good place to see the Jewish perspective on this, and the Jewish, for lack of a better term, philosophy behind this is in the book of Job. In the book of Job, you have this Sadiq Job, who is very, very righteous. He's punctilious in his deeds. He's punctilious in his beliefs. Yet he suffers greatly, and it's not a people. I think there is, at least in the Christian world, there's some sort of oh no, it wasn't God. It was Satan who did all of this to him. But the problem with that is that Satan is a subordinate of God in this story. Satan is in the heavenly court, and Satan is only there to present reality, and then God says, of course, do what you must and whatever. And Rambam's opinion, it's a long, and I don't want to oversimplify it because it's a very intricate discussion, and maybe one day we should do a few sessions on the book of Job to see if we can really understand what's happening in that book. It's 40 chapters long. It's a long book, but there's so much. It's a gold mine of information and wealth of knowledge. But Satan is the physical condition in the book of Job. By being alive, you are existing in a world that has physical reality. And our deeds, no matter how good they are, they don't really impact the physical reality. And through that, Satan and other intermediaries in this world, other angels, if you will, gravity, sunlight, nature, aging, health, all of these things are how we interact with God's ketzef v'rahamim. His ketzef and his rahamim is mercy. Ketzef is, in literary language, means fury and wrath. But if I'm not mistaken, ketzef can also mean like foam. Is that correct, Yoram? Can I use ketzef to mean foam?
Yeah, it's a modern word. It means the cream and the foam on top.
Yeah, like you ketzef it, right? You go to an ice cream shop, we call it ketzef it. It's ketzef is something that is happening because of the turbulence of something. There's turbulent something, and what's that, Yoram?
Well, ketzef could be for shaving. You can also eat it too. So
But it's something that's whipped up, correct?
Could be.
Yeah. Like shaving cream, you lather that up. There's an action that goes into it. So like, it's something that is the product of turbulence, I would say. Turbulence in the world, turbulence in nature. And that's how we interact with it, and we interpret it. Our interpretation, our reading of it is as God's wrath, God's anger. That's how I would explain it. And it's not necessarily, in this world, you have punishment and you have reward, but really we believe that punishment and reward comes from ultimately in the next world, where there is a world of emet again. We live in a world of tov vera, and tov vera is all about my subjective feelings on things. I think political policy X is good, but you could think political policy X is bad. It's not that one of us is objectively correct. That's based off of our subjective relation to it. But I couldn't then say, no, the world is flat and that's bad. And you couldn't say, no, the world is round and that's good. That's not subject to tovera. That's either emet or sheker. That's only true or false. There's no opinion on whether the world is round or not. It's not a difference of opinion. It's a more or less what the facts are. So in the world of truth, where we have all of the facts, all of the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we no longer see wrath as wrath or Rahamim as good. We see it for what it really is. And the Chachamim are very careful to point that out to us, that there are things in life that may seem very good for us. We might be happy about it, but ultimately it will lead to something bad. And there might be things that are very difficult and bad for us, but it will ultimately lead to something good. And there's a very interesting sugya in the Gemara about when a person who, a parent, Bar Minan, passes away, but they were very wealthy. So they leave a massive fortune to the inheritance. So on the one hand, they say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emeth, the prayer you say when you're mourning, when someone passes away, blessed be the true judge. But also there's an idea of saying, Baruch Hatov Hamitiv, thank you God for being good and gracious because of this massive fortune that I've come into contact with. So the idea of God being, and I want to notice here, the two sinners and the two righteous, I see who you are, just give me 1 second. The two sinners and the two righteous, that is inputted, that was edited in by the editor. Really in the original Hebrew, it says V'ketzev Rahamim, well not the original Hebrew, but it says V'ketzev Rahamim. I would be very interested to see how it said it in the original Judeo-Arabic, but it's just saying that God is the ultimate arbitrator of these things that are good and bad. There aren't other gods out there, a God who's bad, who's doing things, or a God who's, good, who's doing things. The only problem with this statement by the Christian is that there seems to be another God in Christianity. And I'm not talking about the Trinity, I'm talking about specifically Satan. Satan does seem to be this powerful opposition to God himself. So I don't know if he'll address that, but we'll see as we go on. Does that help, Eleanor, at all?
Yes, it does some.
Okay.
But what about the idea of God showing wrath or anger is being more a human trait than a godly one?
It definitely is human. And there are times in the Tanakh where Rambam would say that the Torah dibar that the Torah dibar b'lashon adam, that the Torah speaks in the language of people, and that what looks like wrath to us is just the way of conveying the story in order to understand a moral lesson, not necessarily that God gets mad. God doesn't have feelings, so it couldn't be that God is wrathful, so to speak. It's just our interpretation, our experience of it.
Yosef?
Yes.
Yeah, I would add to this that this gets down to the whole concept of how the religion looks at suffering. And I think we have a nuanced, complex way of dealing with the suffering in the world. Mm-hmm. And, you've touched on the anthropomorphic aspects of the way the text deals with this. But what's hinted at here and in Job, of course, and which I hope that we can study someday, it would be very useful, is that it is a nuanced and careful examination of suffering in the world, our suffering in the world. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Christians, I would say, took the easy way out. Christianity shoved the whole thing aside and said, yeah, this world sucks. The next world is where you get your where righteousness pays off.
Very good.
And they punted the whole thing into heaven and hell.
Very good.
Because they could not answer that essential problem which Judaism deals with on a more subtle and a deeper level, because we're much more focused on what we do in this life, and we're saying, maybe the next life has some justification. There are things that we don't understand. Mm-hmm. There's this dichotomy between tov and ra, and God says this very eloquently in Job that I did all this stuff and you're worried about a gourd. You can't understand what I do.
Right. There's in Job, that's specifically God says, finally speaks to Job, says, you don't know, you weren't there when I laid the foundations of the world. So how can you try to understand what I'm doing to you?
Right. So I think that's a huge difference, which is frequently glossed over, but just it's such an essential difference between Judaism and Christianity,
Right.
what they did with that problem.
Absolutely. And this does get into the different ways we view reality, and at least classically. The Nevi'im and the Hachamim viewed reality in a semiological fashion rather than a metaphysical fashion. Meaning they saw everything in the universe as being somehow a message or writing of God. This is the writing of God. God is actively the author of this universe, as opposed to a metaphysical reality where you have these I don't know what to call them, spheres. You have whatever it is that makes reality, drives reality the way it goes, and that can be and one of those drivers of reality is chaos, and chaos just kind of comes in, and there's no real way of dealing with it. So we blame it on the devil, we blame it on Satan, we blame it on sin. We say, oh, it's whatever it is, and not trying to see the deeper message behind it. It's the ultimate. It's really underlies also the story, the difference between the epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Parashat Noah. Parashat Noah really, the message is that human beings are responsible for their actions, and they are the ones who lead to this flood. Whereas in the epic of Gilgamesh, it's that, people are loud going about their daily lives, and the gods want to sleep. So the gods, it'd be the easiest way of dealing with this, just destroy the whole world with a flood, and we can get some shut-eye. And at the end, when Noah offers up a sacrifice, it's about connecting into and cementing a berit. But when in the epic of Gilgamesh, when they offer up the sacrifice, it's to feed the gods who have been hungry for all these, all the time there's been a flood, because no one's been offering them sacrifices. So there's a difference of how we view the reality and what the message behind a phenomenon are. Yoram, I see you have your hand up. Thank you for waiting so patiently. Hold on a second. There you go.
Patience is a virtue. I have a theological problem with an angry God, because in our Musar, we say that anger is avodah zarah, which we humans sometimes have it, but there is no way God could be associated with anger. If we believe that God has unconditional love, that could be that we get punished. So, Chosech shivto soneh bno, he who doesn't punish his son, like hates his son. So I view it more like relationship between now and our children. We may punish them, we may ground them, but it's all out of love, not out of anger. At least sometimes you yell at your kids because we are human. And then I say, oh my God, what am I doing? Because they could drive you nuts sometimes, particularly if there is more than one of them. I could see my daughter and her grandkids. So that's one issue. The other issue is our righteous people. In our tradition, there is a particular space related, which I don't believe it holds in Christianity, to my knowledge, i.e., I know I have my friend who is now bringing the Geula every week, who is in a different righteous person. A couple of days ago, he was on Kever Rachel tomb. He goes to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because you believe that the place of burial has a separate virtues to get us to change the Gzerot, including tzedakah and tefillah prayer and charity. And Eliyahu Navi could have moved the Purim decree to kill all the Jewish people. How do you see that as related to space, and is there anything comparable in Christianity or Islam?
Oh, wow. So I don't know. In Jewish practice, in traditional Jewish practice, it's actually frowned upon to go to a kever and to pray at a kever. It's a place of tumah. A kever is a grave. We see it as like as a practice of the nations. And we do see that in Christianity. I'm not so sure about Islam. I think Islam has a very straight and narrow monotheistic approach. In Christianity, the idea of going to the saints, asking the saints to bring some sort of redemption, that's definitely a Christian practice. There are, that being said, there are sects in the Jewish people that do go to graves and pray at graves, but it's interesting. Harambam says in his Mishneh Torah, and it's not really his idea, it's from the Gemara, that we do not erect a headstone at the graves of the Hachamim, because it's called a matzeva. It's a memorial stone. It says they don't need that because their matzeva are their works, are their writings, are their teachings. The Hasidim, the Hachamim, the Nevi'im, they're not really gone. They live on in their teachings. And when we learn it, there's a saying in the Gemara, their lips move in the grave. It's not a physical, their lips are actually moving in the grave. It's saying that like when we implement the teachings of our ancestors, that is really how we connect with the past and move forward. But like the idea of going to graves and praying at them, there could be there could be reasons why it's people engage in it, but for the most part there isn't a real good source for why it's okay. In fact, Chacham Ovadia Yosef, he was the last, he wasn't the last, but when he was the chief rabbi of Israel, there was a custom that every year people were supposed to go to the grave of Shimon Bar Yochai on what's it called? On Lag BaOmer, or Lag LaOmer, on the 33rd day of the Omer, and there was supposed to be a big bonfire there and a celebration. And he didn't go, and people asked him why he didn't go, and he said, "Why would I go? I have Shimon Bar Yochai right here. Why would I go to some grave and waste my time?" So there's that idea here that really engaging with the words of the sages and the words of the prophets, that's what connects us to them, so to speak, if we need that connection. Carol, go ahead.
Well, what about visiting your family members' graves? Is that wrong?
So that is different. There is an idea that we're supposed to upkeep the graves of our family members. We're supposed to go there, keep it clean, and there's a custom. Go ahead.
You can put oil.
Put oil and the candles, things like that. Yeah, and there's even a very ancient custom of before Rosh Hashanah or Kippur or Pesach that there is a pilgrimage to the graveyards to keep them up, to clean them, and like what Yoram was saying, get inspiration from their actions to better yourself now. That's the real ma'ala, what's it called, ma'ala, benefit of going to the graveyard in that case. So that's 100% okay and permitted.
Yosef?
Yes, go ahead.
Just to pursue this a little more, because then what do you say about the cave in the Machpelah, Rachel's tomb, all the places up in Tzfat? I heard what you said, but manifestly in Israel today, this is done. And not just by sectarians. It's pretty normative, I think.
Absolutely, 100%. So, there's an interesting Gemara in, where is it? Is it in Berahot? I think it's in Berahot, but it's been such a long time since I learned it. So sorry, excuse me if I get it incorrect. But it says that when they were scouting the land, when they were conquering the land of Israel, Joshua and Caleb, Caleb went to the cave of Machpelah to visit the patriarchs and the matriarchs and to pray there. And that's why he was given Hebron as his inheritance. So we were talking about that in our Beit Midrash recently, like what's going on here? And do we learn halakha from this? Or is it an agarata, meaning is it a story with a moral lesson behind it to try to teach us something about the power of prayer, or like why. There's a whole bunch of questions of like what's going on, and there's a lot of there's a very nice letter from Rabbi Yosef Messas. He was asked about this practice, if it's something we should be engaging in or not engaging in. And of course, you had the both sides of this argument very loudly talking about it. And he writes a very nice letter debunking a lot of the reasons people say you shouldn't go. He has his own reasons why he says you shouldn't go, but I can't remember what the reason is in my head. And like mostly the reason he was debunking them is because when people say the people who go to Uman and the people who go to the Rachel's grave or the Machpelah, that they're engaging in avodah zarah. And Rabbi Massas says, "Has v'shalom." Why would we say that they're doing avodah zarah? Why would that be the first? These are Jewish people we're talking about. Why do we need to be casting aspersions against each other that are so treasonous, so hefty? There are many other reasons that we can say that are terrible and you shouldn't go, but avodah zarah shouldn't be one of them. So it's become popular, and it's definitely popular. You know, people even visit the grave of Harambam, and that's something Harambam would be very, very upset about. I bet every time someone comes to his grave talking to Rambam's rolling around in there. And if it's the right grave, of course, because there are 3 different burial sites that Rambam is in. So I don't have a good reason or good answer why sociologically it became so popular. And I don't want to use it was very popular in the times of the kings to build a bama in the backyard. And that, of course, was not in compliance with the law. You can't build an altar in your backyard, but people still did it. It was widespread. And they weren't praying to Baal Molech. They were praying to, our God, to Adonai. So the idea that, it's coming, it's the intentions are in the right place. The actions, however, might not be so kasher. So that's the whole drive here with the Kuzari to connect it into there. But yeah, it's I used to pray. When I was in yeshiva, I lived down the street from the grave of Shimon Hasadik, who is buried in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, an Arab neighborhood. And I would I remember my roommate, he would want me to walk with him to the kever to pray early in the morning. And I would go there, and it was very interesting because the kever is right there. It's the kever, I mean like the grave. The grave is right there, and you have people down there saying shahrit, praying. And it just, I went only a few times, but I couldn't go anymore because it just felt weird. But it's interesting because like they do Birkat Kohanim there, and Kohanim are not allowed to be under the same roof as a body, as a corpse, and allowed to be in a graveyard. So what they did, even though they were still under the same roof, they would stay at the top of the stairs and they would do the Birkat Kohanim from up there. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, I don't know. But it's very interesting that even though you have clear-cut halachot of like, where do we pray? People, it's good. The Kuzari is going to address this very soon when we get later into the essay of the concept of ijtihad. Ijtihad is where the law isn't really more of a suggestion than what's really important is what I want to do and how I feel and how I want to connect, which isn't bad. You need some ijtihad. You need some passion in the religion. It can't just be cold law. You have to have life. You have to have imagination. There's all kinds of things there, but there is definitely a balance of how it works. Yoram.
Well, it's not just Uman. People go to Brooklyn to the Lubavitch Rabbi Ohel, and it's not Chabad, right? Even non-religious people go because they believe that you can get a bracha, a blessing, and make a request. And, we even seen Kushner and Ivanka when before the elections, it didn't produce the desirable outcome for them so far, but at least they went to the oil.
Yeah. Here, I think the idea is whenever you go somewhere and you're going to use a tzaddik or a grave, it's not about praying to the tzaddik. Of course not. Never, ever pray to the tzaddik. Never pray to the grave. Never even ask the tzaddik, can you help me in Olam Haba? Can you talk to God? That's, I mean, there are examples in poetic license that you can have poetic license. During Salihot, we say, Anenu Allah deme'ir anenu. Answer us, God of Ridi Meir, answer us. You know, we're not saying Anenu Ridi Meir, talk to Allah, talk to God and tell him to say, no, we're saying to God directly. And that's the important point, is to petition God directly always. But the other idea is going to a grave or putting on tefillin or putting on a talet. They're not amulets. They are mitzvot. The tefillah is not a vending machine. It is a mitzvah. It is not a time to, you don't say to God, I put in my shahrit, I will take me, give me whatever I desire. Now, that's not how it works. Tefillah is a conscious effort to align your will with God's will. It's not always easy. It's not always fruitful. And of course, I'm not saying that you don't petition God. Petition God, ask God for this, ask God for that. Like, you should pray for people, pray on their behalf. But it's not a vending machine at the end of the day. It's not a guaranteed result. Of course, you know, it seems like in the Gemara, we're getting way off topic, but I just want to say this. It seems like in the Gemara, it does say that, you know, your prayers weren't answered, pray harder. You didn't do it right. Do it again. I don't know how that works. I do know that it's something that I also try to figure out what's the mechanism here, but I always see tefillah first and foremost as a judgment on myself. Lehit palel. It's a reflexive verb. I am trying to see where am I in my relationship with Kadosh Baruch Hu, rather than the other way around. If anyone owes an answer to anybody, God doesn't owe me an answer. I owe an answer to God. Carol, go ahead.
I'm thinking about this. I know there's a Jewish custom to leave a stone when you visit a grave site. Now, I mean, Tom and I have found ancestors' graves in different places, and I've visited my great-grandparents' graves in Israel. Wow. But now I know my son-in-law, I think my daughter said it's not his custom to visit a cemetery like that, and because his father's deceased. But now I'm really wondering what is really considered right. I mean, I just go and think of my family members when I go, and I don't know what's considered right or wrong now that are you people afraid they're going to tempt death too?
I heard that. I think that's more that idea. I think you're tempting death. That's more of a superstition. Leaving the rock, that definitely is an Ashkenazi custom. Sephardim also picked it up. But, you know, there are different customs, and those are totally innocuous, I believe. You know, in Seattle, the Sephardim leave flowers at the grave, and I know that in certain Ashkenazi circles, leaving flowers, that's might as well be praying the rosary. It's the exact same thing. So it's all it's all different customs. So when it I know that Sephardim, and especially in like the Northern African circles and Moroccan circles, there is a big uncomfort of going to a grave. And in Israel, and I don't think this is a good custom, but in Israel, there's a minhag pashut, meaning a very widespread minhag, that sons do not go to the funerals of their fathers. And it has to do with demonic forces and like all kinds of nonsense like that. And it's the problem there is that now you have uprooted a mitzvah deoraita, a mitzvah that comes from the Torah, and replaced it with demonic superstitions. So in that regard, not you, but like the state of Israel. I mean, in this case, not even the state of Israel, the rabbinate of Israel, who should know better. So when my rabbi's father passed away last December, he went to the funeral, and he was getting yelled at by other people at his father's funeral for going to his funeral and telling him all the pain he was causing his father in Gehenna and all this nonsense. And it's like, is that how you comfort people? Is that how you engage with somebody who just lost their parent and they have to go through all the bureaucratic red tape? There's a lot to say on the Hevra Kadisha in Israel. Another rabbi of mine whose father passed away in June also had to deal with a bunch of not only bureaucratic red tape and money and stuff, but also superstitions. And it's important in Judaism to know when the superstitions are affecting you in a negative way. If the superstitions are first off, even if they're affecting you in a positive way, I think stop the superstitions. But if definitely they're affecting you in a negative way, don't pay any regard to them. So when it comes to like going to a graveyard, if that's good and you want to see where they're buried and you want to clean it and you want to see, that's totally fine. It's totally fine. It's one thing to visit the graveyard. It's another thing to go to the graveyard and fast so you can sleep on the grave and invite the dead into your dreams. That's a whole different thing. So that's and I think, people can discern that for themselves and how what's appropriate. I did get a question about God not having emotions, and to just explain that a little bit more. The idea that God doesn't have emotions, what I mean by that is that emotions are a product of chemicals in our brain. They're products of our physical organ, of the mental, of the brain, of the mind. God not having a physical body, of course, doesn't have a physical mind, and of course, because of that, also doesn't have dopamine and serotonin and other chemicals that then influence the emotive feelings that would come out of that. So when we say God feels anger or feels wrath or feels any of these things, it's a metaphor to describe God in that way. God, of course, doesn't have these physical limitations. So by saying God feels something then puts a limitation on God. And that's part of Harambam's negative theology. But it's not to say like it's hard to think of God in purely philosophical modes. And so that's why, the Torah even gives us the ability to call God Gadol and Atagibor and all these things and give him appellations. But it's not it's just meaning to say that God isn't actually upset or angry, and especially because we say in the Talmud that anger is like avodah zarah, all kinds of stuff. That anger is not a good trait. So that's what we mean by that. I hope that helps answer the question. Okay, any other comments, questions before we move on to the next klal here?
It's getting late.
Oh, you know what? Good point. We should probably end here. It's 45 minutes. So next week we'll pick up with what the rest of what the Christian has to say. And if there are any other comments, questions before we close.
No, great discussion.
You have to always keep us.
Brought up a lot.
Why do we have to keep us honest?
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah,
All right,
really
then.
enjoyed today.
Thanks
Good.
a lot.
Of course. Thank you, everybody. Have a good
yep.
Wednesday.
Joseph,
Thank you.
I just wanted to share a joke with you. You
Please.
said tefillah isn't a vending machine.
Yeah.
Is it a slot machine?
Maybe it is. That's funny.
See you next week.
See you next week. Happy